So massive welcome. This is our first change chat that we have run. So you are guinea pigs for us at the moment, I'm afraid. And I just wanted to give you a bit of introduction to explain why we've set these up and what it is that we're trying to achieve. It's obviously really, really difficult times for everybody at the moment. Pretty much everybody has been impacted in some way by the coronavirus epidemic, and it's obviously very worrying in various different ways for people. But what we have seen in recent weeks is some really amazing examples of really positive change happening in organisations, and that change happening at a pace that's really quite unusual, that we've not seen before. So change programs that you would expect to take 2 years, getting a whole organisation to work from home, has happened really, really quickly and practically overnight. So we just wanted to have some conversations with other people, with other organisations who have managed to deliver these changes at such a fast pace, to see what we can learn and see if there's a different way of doing change going forward. We obviously can't be in that crisis mode forever, and I know that a lot of that is what's instigated the speed of change that's happened, but I think it's important to try and take some of the good from that forward. So we've got a really, really great panel today, so thank you for joining us. So we have Ken Massa, who is from Rossendale Leisure, who's the chief exec there, who's going to be talking about his experience in Rossendale, obviously having to move away from the leisure stuff and work on that kind of getting communities up and running and being able to support people. We have Kieran Keane and Mark Davis from Lancaster City Council, who in a similar way have set up a community hub to support their local residents. And we've got Sanjay McIntosh, who is representing London for us today. So I know we are mostly northerners on this call. And Sanjay's been working with Haringey Council to set up a community hub there. And really, I think working better with communities is something that certainly in local authority, which is where most of my work is, it's something that we've talked about for a long time, but then we've suddenly managed to make this happen very quickly, practically overnight. So really, that's what I wanted to reflect about today. So Sanjay, can I come to you first? Do you want to tell us a little bit about what's happened in Haringey?
I feared you would start with me, Lucy, and I should have asked that question, but hello to everybody, and really good to see you all on this call this morning. Thank you to Lucy and colleagues for kind of organising it and joining and being part of it. It's always good when you're on one of these calls that you see nobody that you know, so hopefully I'll try and that will help me to be clearer than probably I would if others were on the call that I did know, but it's good to see some new faces. It's been even more in this context because you don't get that many opportunities to do that at the moment, so thanks and welcome. So if you want me to just give a quick intro as to what we've done in Haringey, it's very hard to do this quickly because it's such a big kind of exercise, and I'm sure other colleagues who you've introduced, Lucy, will share some of these views, but I'll just give you a bit of an idea of what we did. So on the 23rd of March, lockdown was announced, and I think it's fair to say that in the lead up to that, we were all starting to get used to what coronavirus and COVID-19 would look like for us in our lives, but that was the moment that everything changed, and the game-changing moment that happened was that date. And the work that I did with Haringey really started then. I was already preparing them for various bits of different service changes that we would have to make, but I don't think any of us could have done that very well to prepare for what we had to do in this context. And what we did was, and we knew, was that we needed to set up a hub, at least, because actually at the time we were told to. The government said, well, there's going to be a number of people across the country. It was estimated to be about 1.5 million people at the time who would be told to shield and stay at home indefinitely. It said for 12 weeks initially, but indefinitely going forward. And those people would not be able to access many things they would, of which the basic need in people's lives is food. And so the government would step in and offer that. And you needed to set up a hub, local authorities, to be able to receive, at the time, what would be a government food delivery that would be delivered onto the shielding group. I think for the kind of Haringey context, that moment in time was on a much bigger scale than we actually probably thought of at the time, and actually the government really understood because while shielding patients and shielding groups of people were important in the COVID-19 context, actually it's people who are vulnerable that are struggling to be able to access the basic need that I've described there, which is food. And actually in Haringey, I've got a few stats here. Haringey as a borough in London, one of 32 and 33 if you include the City of London, is the 4th most deprived borough in London. And one of the wards, which is Northumberland Park, which is right in where Tottenham Hotspur Stadium is, the new one, is now, since COVID, the most deprived ward in the country. So the scale of poverty, and in this context, food poverty in that particular part of the borough, was already significant, and it was already known that there were challenges around vulnerability in that area. And actually what we had to do was mobilise something quickly that actually was much further beyond and ready for people who were vulnerable that wouldn't be able to access food, because as we know at the time, there were people who, the other things that were happening were supermarkets were closing, shops were closing. You couldn't go about your normal life and access food in the way you normally could. Couldn't get online deliveries, and actually food supply started to become a significant challenge. So with the Haringey context and in that sort of wider vulnerability and food poverty sense, we very quickly decided that we needed more than one hub, and we set up two. And in about 2 to 3 days, we contacted 2 partners in the borough. And this is the thing with kind of London, it's got particular kind of landmarks and partners in many boroughs that kind of offer their support in this situation and just are already infrastructure-wise there and ready to be able to help. And one of those was Tottenham Hotspur Football Stadium, and the other one was Alexandra Palace, which are both in the borough. And we, on the 23rd of March, which was the Tuesday, Monday, or was it the Tuesday? Who knows in this world? It was one of those days. It was earlier in the week. By the Saturday, we had set up both of those hubs, and firstly, initially received the government food parcel, which was quite small for shielded groups, but then mobilised an effort to support a wider group of people, which on our first day of operation, which was Monday, the 30th of March, we had delivered 300 food parcels to 300 different households, having over the course of that weekend arranged to have surplus food delivered from a group of charitable organisations in the borough, and then started to purchase our own food, which I can touch on a little bit more with colleagues. We carried on, and I'm going to probably pause there for a minute, Lucy, because I could talk about the chronology of this in a load of detail. But basically, I think the thing is that I think others would share is that we had to do something very quickly, and we had to do something that responded to the wider needs of the community. And that's where we started. We started by saying, what do we know about how the Haringey community and communities in Haringey? There's 180 different languages spoken in that borough, in this borough. And what is that going to mean that we need to do as a local authority? Not what the government's telling us to do, which was unclear and actually quite changeable at times, but actually what we need to do. And what we decided that we needed was 2 hubs, and we need to source our own food, and we need to supplement what the government was offering at the time in order to do that. And we need to do it quickly. So I described it in a piece I wrote for the NJ as a humanitarian effort, an epic effort, a humanitarian model where you just have to go in quickly and do what is right, and focus on doing what is right for what you know your communities need at that time, and that was by far and away food. So I'll pause there, Lucy, if that's okay, as a bit of an intro and a bit of context from the Haringey perspective, and let others come in. Is that okay?
Fine. So Kieran and Mark, do you want to tell us a little bit about Lancaster and how you think you managed to make it happen so quickly?
Okay, well, I'll do a bit of an overview, and I think Mark can pick up on all the actual things that we actually did. But I think it was a similar situation where we did actually reinvent ourselves in about 3 days, and we concentrated on 3 key focuses, and that was supporting vulnerable people, supporting businesses, and maintaining frontline services. And so we reallocated most of our we'd already grouped our staff into tiers in terms of urgency of work that they were doing, and people from less urgent needs were moved into the to focus on those immediate needs very quickly. And I think you've got a sort of 2-pronged need emerging very quickly. You've got the whole sort of food poverty element that Sanjay's mentioned. Then you've got these whole groups that just could not access food because of their circumstances in terms of health and shielding and all those things. And I think Mark will come on to it in more detail. I think what we did was anticipate that need, and I think it's a key point. None of us have waited for guidance. There are enough bright people in these organisations that you sat down and went, well, what do we need in this locality? And we'd already, again, a bit like Sanjay, got existing partners. And it was about calling in all those favours very quickly in terms of the community, in terms of food banks, transport, our staff, our stakeholders and colleagues in health. And I think that hub, our hub, it existed before the actual command and instruction to set up a hub came out. And what we did was then we sort of flexed it a little bit to fit those emerging needs that then did come out from government. So it was up and running very quickly. And I think we supplemented and complemented all that by very quickly getting up a phone access service so that we were there for people very early on. And then we built from that pretty quickly then in terms of how it all worked. But I think Mark will be able to fill us in on how that logistic actually panned out in detail.
Thank you. Hello. So I'm Mark Davis. I'm Director for Communities and Environment at Lancaster City Council. I think what was interesting listening to Sanjay and Kieran is that one of to me, the sort of key to success was sort of a long time before the actual emergency. Certainly in Lancaster, we'd had significant flooding in Storm Desmond, and then we had significant flooding in 2017. And we kind of learned from that. So the adage, fail to prepare, prepare to fail, is certainly the case, I think, and that's been the reason for success. The keys that we already had were resources. So the council had always taken the view that keeping frontline services in-house was the best for many reasons. But the fact that we have a direct workforce, we've got in Lancaster, we're a district council, so we've got about 850 staff. So all our frontline services like waste collection, grounds maintenance are all in-house. So we've got those resources we can call upon. We've got strong partnerships. So the Lancashire Resilience Forum, strong partnership. In the district, we've got strong partnerships with the NHS, police, fire and rescue, etc. The council, we had all-out elections the May before. The new administration got a very sort of clear vision, real focus on community engagement, real focus on reducing inequality. So we already had this sort of clear vision of how the council should respond in this case, and we got sort of strong networks on the ground from previous emergencies. We got sort of a local resilience group. So, and we'd also tested our emergency planning on lots and lots of occasions. So when this emergency began, we were already prepared. We were already sort of ready to mobilize. We knew the drill. Obviously, it was an unprecedented emergency, but if we hadn't have got that in before, then we would have probably struggled. So as Sanjay described, you know, we got to the point where we set up a community hub and a business hub. The community hub we set up in partnership with the existing Morecambe Bay Food Bank. So like the situation Sanjay described, Lancaster got about 145,000 population. We've got some areas, we've got some lovely rural areas, but we have also got some areas of huge deprivation. So we've got that sort of contrast. So, and we got an existing food bank operation that was well established, well run, and a sort of wider food network. So immediately we approached Morecambe Bay Food Bank. We set up a partnership. We used our local sports centre as the community hub. Our elected members, as soon as the crisis broke, took the swift decision to allocate £1 million worth of reserves to vulnerable people and £1 million worth of reserves to businesses, which meant that for the food hub, we knew we couldn't just rely on donations because we were expecting a huge increase in demand. So it meant that we could buy food. What we did was use local suppliers. So we had a local distributor who just on that morning was just about to furlough all his staff. So we rang up and said, look, can you start supplying our food bank operation? So that was of great benefit to, that was an initial benefit to the local economy. At that point in time, all the panic buying was going on. So food supplies were quite difficult to get, but because we had this sort of local distribution unit, we managed to sort of secure food supplies. And then as things settled down, we've got a really good sort of distribution network. So we've got lots of donations coming in, but we're still having to supplement it with purchasing food directly. To give you an idea of the scale, prior to COVID, the food bank was delivering to about sort of 100 households per week. At the peak, which was at the end of April, we were delivering to 840 households per week. Over 10,000 food parcels have now been delivered. And we don't expect that this is going to stop anytime soon. You know, the initial health crisis obviously resulted in an increased demand, but I think the economic crisis that follows on from that will be far worse. That's where the real sting in the tail will be. And from my point of view, as a public servant, the really worrying thing is that this isn't just something that's directly related to COVID. It's something that's probably been hidden before. You know, the fact that we've got a food bank in the district tells you a tale. The fact that we've got a food network in the district tells you a tale. What has happened is that now it's sort of risen in people's consciousness, but we can't just let it go now. You know, if our residents haven't got food, you know, there's some sort of basic problem there, isn't there, that we need to address in the longer term. Similarly, the community hub started embarking on contacting our shielded people, our vulnerable people. We made huge efforts on that. So far, we've rung around about 29,000 people. So over 20% of our residents have had a phone call to check their welfare. If we can't contact them by phone, send a member of staff. We've reallocated, as I said before, we've got about 850 full-time staff. We've reallocated about 300 staff from our non-essential services to supporting our vulnerable people team. Again, it's sort of unprecedented. We're a district council. We're not sort of, you know, we're not responsible for social services in normal times. So this has represented a huge shift, but I think one that ties in very much with our council's corporate plan. It's one that's really sort of shown the leadership that the district council provides. It's one that's shown the agility that a district council provides, and it's one that I think that in the future, once we start to sort out where our priorities lie, it has to be in making sure that our most vulnerable people get supported and that we focus on reducing inequalities.
So I'm getting really from what both of you have said so far that the not waiting for guidance, taking action quickly, having pre-existing relationships with key members of your community groups, with partners, and having that kind of tried and tested emergency planning was key to making it happen so quickly. Ken, do you want to tell us a little bit about Rossendale and what your reflections have been on how you've managed to make it happen so fast?
Yeah, sure. Of course, welcome everybody and good morning. I think what's really interesting, just listening to the others talk about the perspective from the council, is I'm coming from a different perspective in that I run a community organisation in Rossendale, the Leisure Trust, though we work closely with the council. And in Rossendale, we've taken a very different approach in some senses, in that our response to the coronavirus pandemic has been largely led through the primary care network and through a GP kind of led response with the council and community organisations as key partners. And probably over 12 months before the pandemic, we'd developed our primary care network to be probably more akin to what you'd see in other authorities as the Health and Wellbeing Partnership. So a number of statutory partners linked in with GPs and the NHS. But we had that established framework, and probably a couple of weeks before lockdown, we'd started to hold weekly primary care network meetings, but with that broader community partnership involved. So the Leisure Trust, the CVS, food banks, other community organisations, and then statutory services like the council, police, fire and rescue, etc. And I think because it had that more community lead, of course, the council got the direction to set up the hub, and that was part of our response. And the hub was set up in one of the leisure centres and in a partnership between the Leisure Trust and the council. But very much it was, the council was a partner and a player within that overall picture, but it would be very hard, I think, in Rossendale to identify who was leading the response. We had a real kind of model of distributed leadership across the whole of the place. And I think that was really powerful in the sense that we were able to harness a really broad set of skills and a broad set of resources really, really quickly in that first couple of days. And I think it was those relationships that were already underpinning it that then it wasn't the council asking organisations, can you help with this or can you do that? We had a forum where organisations were saying, we can do this part, we can organise volunteers, we can distribute food, we can do this, and together people kind of almost just grabbed areas of responsibility, not from any sense of how much will we get paid to do this, but just a real, I think, sense of motivated by principle rather than payslip, I suppose. People just wanting to make a difference to local people's lives. And we took quite a different model in terms of same challenges in terms of food, and in our area, a big challenge around delivery of prescriptions, which almost outweighed the need for food in some respects. We've got quite an old population, probably split into two kind of key demographics, really. We have got some significant areas of deprivation, but we've got some significant areas of wealth as well in Rossendale. But across both of those populations, if you like, quite an older population. And so the ability to get medicine, even though they could order food from the supermarkets and get a delivery or whatever it might be, getting prescriptions was really challenging. But we took a slightly different model in that we set off with this ambition that we would try to link every person and every household in need with a volunteer who would support them through the crisis, with whatever that household needed, whether that was food delivery from a food bank or collecting food from a supermarket if they could afford to buy it for themselves, or delivering prescriptions or whatever it might be. So we focused our effort in the very first 2 or 3 days on recruiting volunteers locally, and that was our big push. And we recruited about 500 volunteers in the first week, and then started the process of, similar to everyone else, making the phone calls out to those within the shielded groups, setting up social media pages, setting up the single point of contact phone line. But our plan was that everyone who contacted us, we would link them with a volunteer who would effectively try to build a relationship and support that household through the course of the pandemic. And that has worked well. And I think probably by and large, I would think the council directly has probably delivered more in the hundreds of food parcels rather than in the thousands, probably even less than 100, because the community network of food banks, I mean, to put that into perspective, we've got a population of around 70,000 in Rossendale, and we've had 5 different food bank organisations, one large one that existed before the crisis, but 4 others who have established themselves within that first week or two, whether that was a church group formally or a different organisation, a Shore Start Centre, or community, the Youth Zone, for example, established themselves very quickly in terms of food banks. So quite a different model in that we've tried to use this volunteer approach, but some similar principles, I guess, in this sense of, I think different from, your typical kind of public sector approach where you decide, you kind of write your report, you plan your risks, you decide what your outcomes want to be. In this setting, we just set off and learned as we went. And I think there was a real power and a real sense of creativity and freedom and also pressure and challenge in that you didn't have everything in place. You were kind of running right from the word go. And I think this sense of distributed leadership has been really important in Rossendale, in that, just allowing other organisations and having a trust that, if they say they can do it, then letting them get on with it and letting organisations take a lead, and not micromanaging too much. And we've really seen people step up to the plate and really blossom and thrive, and community organisations really show their their worth and value in the community. And I think it's been quite an eye-opener for statutory partners that actually there's some real power within the community that can make a difference that the council could have probably never done by themselves. So that gives you a flavour of Rossendale. Again, like Sanjay, I could probably fill the next half an hour if you wanted me to, but I probably shouldn't.
Thank you. So we've done, so in some cases, I'm sure all areas are different in terms of what foundations they already had in place and what kind of relationships they already have with their partners in place. So I'm sure that will vary across the national picture. But we do have a question from Paula, who was working in Walsall at the beginning of the crisis, is now in Worcestershire. Have I said that right? It's a bit of a controversial one, Worcester and Worcestershire.
Yes, it's Worcestershire. Lucy, hi all.
So you were asking what's the kind of future of this and turning some of these foundations we've put in place into a longer term way of supporting those with preventative and earlier help needs. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, and thank you to colleagues who've already been dropping notes back. So I'm the Director of People, so that includes, I'm the DAS, I'm the Lead Commissioner for Children's, which has been on an improvement journey. We're in intervention. I've also got public health and communities, and I'm just absolutely heartwarmed by what we've been doing. You know, I'm proper old school, 30 odd years NHS and social care experience, so it takes me back to, you know, what actually civic responsibility we're here to do. Really struck by Mark's comments actually, that you know, the ability to sort of well, you know, the insight that this isn't a problem that's just emerged because of COVID, but actually, you know, we have got lots of different cohorts of people in our communities that struggle for all sorts of reasons. And my sort of push being new in Worcestershire is to say to colleagues, how do we harness this opportunity and these support systems that we put in place and join that up across a whole system? And actually there's a real challenge for councils to kind of get a bit out of that space, because there's so much enabling that's happening at a, you know, at a local and partnership level. But if we can be part of steering that and, you know, resourcing it and putting some of our workforce and buildings into that, we can create a real, I suppose, you know, in my jargon, prevention and sort of safety net for people, be that people who've got homeless issues, or they're socially isolated, or they're subject to domestic abuse, or they're just finding it really difficult to kind of cope because, you know, finances are really tight. That's kind of my little dream for all this. And it's just great to hear how, you know, how many of you are probably thinking about what this might become rather than withering on the vine, you know, if we get to the end of COVID, really.
So who'd like to take that in terms of what your plans, Mark? What are your plans for the future with all this work that we've done?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, because my view has always kind of been that as far as the council goes, we're not there to sort of do everything. The bricks are already there in the community. So in Lancaster, like most areas, there are lots of organisations, there are lots of community groups who are, as already been mentioned, perfectly capable of getting on with things and doing things. But what we need to do as a council is sort of provide the mortar, as it were, put all the bricks together, provide resources, provide support, provide sort of expertise where necessary, but not take over, because that sort of patriarchal view never ever works. So where we are now is in this sort of curious position where we're still dealing with the emergency, and that will last for a long time yet. But for whatever reason, you know, the government is sort of pushing things on so that people have forgotten about the emergency and we're heading towards recovery. So I think that's going to be a real roller coaster thing. So there are still going to be the challenges of the emergency to deal with, but there's also the challenges of the recovery. And certainly from our council's point of view, the council's corporate priorities before COVID are still really relevant, but this will help us. It's sort of provide a catalyst so that we can work in a more agile way, so that we can deliver more quickly on the really important priorities. And our council cabinet on Tuesday night agreed a plan which is called sort of recovery circles, five sort of areas of work, two of which are related to communities, one on climate change, because that's an even bigger emergency that needs to be addressed. One on making sure that our council services work in the most agile and efficient way, and one on a sort of regenerative, redistributed economy. So that's where we want to go to. So what we're doing is we're using the sort of the best things of our response from COVID, putting them into our recovery, and we absolutely know that we're going to have this sort of sustained long-term approach to looking after our most vulnerable residents and our businesses. Otherwise, there's going to be all kinds of sort of wheels fall off. And again, that's not necessarily the role that, we could just be a sort of administrative, bureaucratic district council, but that's not going to help our residents. So we're kind of shifting from some of the things that we normally do. Cutting the grass is now not quite as important, or weeds growing on the street, as feeding people. So there's a lot of work to do there, because there's lots of expectations, and some people still desperately upset if a weed is outside their house. But it's a real sort of strategic shift, and really exciting, and what public service should be about.
Sanjay, you've raised your hand. Do you want to add any comments?
I have, and can you hear me all right? I just had to take my headphones out. Hopefully the audio is all right. I sort of tried to do a quick response in the chat to your question, Paula, that you raised earlier, but I thought I'd just add a little bit more into it. I think what was interesting in Haringey's, we did absolutely go in as a sort of, as I call it, that humanitarian kind of do it all, and actually slightly different from colleagues who have spoken already on this call is that we had the kind of partnership infrastructure and voluntary sector infrastructure, but it was more federated and disparate. So what I mean by that is that there were already food hubs, food provision already taking place pre-COVID because of the level of poverty I've outlined in particular parts of the borough. Those remained, but they were saying to the council, we have no capacity to be and scale in order to be able to get hold of food and to distribute them. So can you step into that space, which is why we set up the two hubs. So we ended up having two main hubs, which then ended up not just delivering directly to households and doing about 300 deliveries a day, but also delivering to what we called sub-hubs, other food bank locations and others, which actually we had the Felix projects and City Harvest and Fair Share as the people securing food from supermarkets and other sources and distributors to donate surplus food into our hubs. They were asking us to be the clearinghouse in order to deliver onwards to food banks in the borough, of which there was about 10, and then a further 4 voluntary sector organisations doing the same thing. It was pretty chaotic and pretty crazy, but I just put in the chat, Paula, that from a prevention early intervention perspective, but actually what we have learned, because we built what we did around an existing function that we were building called Connected Communities, which is the purpose of the team, is to connect all of the organisations locally, statutory, non-statutory and so on, to intervene and prevent early in a holistic way. So I mean by that, catching the kind of wider problems in people's lives as you would expect from the normal kind of principles of prevention early intervention, Paul, that I'm sure you're kind of more than kind of familiar with and have driven in where you've been so far. I just left in the chat there that the scale of the number of people we came across through this lens of food poverty was just beyond what we knew. So 40% of the people and households that we have supported through this operation since March, which is near on about 3,000 different households, is with multiple people in it, from single person to the largest household we had was 9 in a household. Is 40% of those people we didn't know about at all before. And that's partly because their circumstances changed through the crisis period of COVID, so loss of jobs. The school situation was a big one around access to free school meal vouchers, which we know was a failed kind of, sorry, that's a bit harsh, but it did fail. It didn't work, this free school meal voucher system at the beginning, did it? It got moving. But who stepped in that period? It was us, right? It was local government. It was the local authorities that normally step into those spaces of policy that fall apart, and we connect with the communities and understand what they need. And what that means to me from a prevention early intervention perspective is that because we now know them, we were able to have wider conversations, support them with universal credit applications, as well as food, but we wouldn't have known about them and they wouldn't have contacted us if their basic need, which was to access food, wasn't there. So they got in touch with us because they needed food, but the conversation we had with them was beyond food. So we understood the school environment, we mobilised an operation to supply To date, we've supplied 300 bits of technology equipment, from laptops to tablets to phones, to vulnerable people who were just completely disconnected, but also to children in households, of multiple households, where they needed to continue with their schoolwork and had no means to do that. And so what we've been able to do is see the broader needs of a household through this lens of food, and then start to provide that ongoing support, which we are now going to transition out of an emergency type model into one that's more sustainable, which I left a couple of thoughts in the chat about what we're doing there. So, you know, in my mind personally, all along has been, how do we kind of move this and sustain it, but from that preventative and early intervention perspective, because we know it is the most important form of support that's needed earlier on. You can't let needs escalate. Final thought is that I do agree with whomever said it, that we have not seen the fullest extent by any stretch of the impact of this, and I think we're going to see that, particularly from the economic perspective, personal, macroeconomic. I think it's going to be significant. So there is a sort of placeholder in our mind as to how you retain a model through food, again, that basic need, that you can scale back up again if you need it, because of a peak in C19 as the virus from a public health perspective, but also just from an economic perspective.
Thank you, Sanjay. Kieran, did you want to add something?
Yeah, just a few quick points. I think, you know, it's a cliche, but this forgiveness not permission approach, I think, is what you have to take, and you have to be happy that 80% is absolutely fine, and we don't need nannying by civil servants. I mean, that came out with our excellent local Lancashire Resilience Forum, where we decided to approach PPE directly and source it early doors so that our care schemes weren't suffering. And it's that sort of attitude is important. Paula made that point about old-fashioned principles, and I think that rings true across all this. But it's also about sometimes old-fashioned approaches are quite good as well. We identified lots of people through a letter going through their letterbox, not through Twitter, not through Facebook, because the whole world, it may be our perception, but the whole world is not connected that way. And I think about continuing this. We are determined to continue this support of vulnerable people. And part of the answer is, as I think people are all mentioning, it's using our volunteer community well. But we mustn't stereotype that. That is not just people who have retired and have got time on their hands. This is about people where we want to encourage businesses. We'll let your staff go free for 2 hours to work on these phones. What we see in a lot of communities are a lot of excellent organisations that deal with a particular issue, say it's Childline or an example, things like that. What I think we are is anything that's an issue, you can come to us for, and we'll signpost you and we'll help you, and it doesn't have to be specific. And we mustn't lose sight of the fact that it's not just that chat on that day that matters. It either might prevent an expensive health intervention because you've got there sooner, or you might actually identify the need for a health intervention that may have been missed otherwise. And if you feel sort of move that in and join it up with the whole loneliness agenda, which is as big an issue as dementia and obesity and those key themes, these are all ways that we can start to rebuild that sort of better, more prosperous, healthy communities. And I think it's really tangible. And the difference between this and everything else is that empathy, feeling, spirit, the people bit that's made all that difference. Even though we've perhaps done it on a screen or on a phone. And that's a bit of an irony. It has worked very well. Thanks.
We do have a comment in the chat from Caroline Jackson, who's talking about the relationship between community members and organisations, and then kind of agencies like the health service and councils and so on, and how those relationships have changed, and that previously it was based around competition, which limited engagement and honest and exchange, but actually more recently it's been more around cooperation, and that has made a real difference, and particularly, she says, in the area of homelessness provision. I just wondered if I could come to you, Ken, because I know you're coming to this from the perspective of representing community groups. Do you feel that that kind of reduction in competition, actually just everybody cooperate and let's get stuff done, has been a big help?
Yeah, I think definitely. I think what we've seen is a real reduction in the short term, but hopefully for the long term, in this kind of transactional relationship between statutory services and community groups and partners. You know, typically in the past, you'd have your service level agreement and you'd deliver to your thing, and you'd spend as much time reporting as you would actually doing good in the community. I think we've moved a lot in terms of trying to establish connections rather than contracts. I think that's been really important. I mean, just on the topic of you know, what are the next steps? One thing that we're doing in Rossendale, which I think is really interesting, is trying to really engage with communities in a very sensitive way about what things that we've experienced during this pandemic, or in what ways have our priorities changed that we want to kind of keep hold of as we move forward as a place. So, you know, we've had a lot more walking and cycling. Is that something we want to keep, and how could we help to facilitate that? We've got cleaner air than we used to have, and is that something we want to keep? We've got a much greater sense of neighbourliness, and how do we foster that? And just trying to engage with communities to think about I think everyone's priorities have changed to a degree. You know, I want to spend more time at home with my children than I used to, and everyone's priorities have perhaps changed a little bit. We want to travel less and use Zoom more. And I think there's one thing that's really important, I think, as we talk about our communities, particularly those most in need, is how do we take them on this journey with us, and how can they be involved in the conversation right from this early starting stage, so that they have a vested interest in what the future of our places look like. So I think the engagement and the conversation at this early stage is really going to be important.
Yeah. I love connections, not contracts. I feel like that needs to be some sort of slogan going forward. The thing I want to ask about, really, and I guess this is because I'm from that change management background, is there's been quite a few words that you guys have used, like being principle motivated, the humanitarian aspect, and the reason I love working in the public sector is because the vast majority of people in the public sector are coming to their work with a real passion and a real desire to help people, and yet somehow we seem to lose that along the way, often because we're tied up in bureaucracy or it gets challenging. And it seems like what you've all been able to do is really reignite that passion to just take risks, don't ask permission, get things done, and help your communities. How do you think you've managed to do that? Who'd like to go first, or is that a big question?
I don't mind it. Sorry, if someone else wants to go. I don't mind having a go, but I can go after.
I mean, I was just going to say one thing. I think we've had to. I think that's been the defining underlying premise of it. We've had to do that. We've had to respond quickly. We've had to, go that extra mile because, it's really brought to, I think, certainly for us, a stark realization that people's lives were genuinely at risk. And all of a sudden, the empathy gap between us not really understanding what it's like to live in some of these really difficult communities, all of a sudden that we felt a little bit, in some ways, much further away, but in some ways much closer together. There's a genuine threat to everybody. And I think that sense of empathy and understanding really motivated a lot of people going the extra mile. A lot of people kind of rekindled that sense of, hang on a minute, this is why I'm here, this is why I work in this sector, this is why I wanted to work in a council setting or public sector organisation to start with. And I think the very sense of the kind of urgency of the pressure, but also the extreme nature of the potential outcome, sort of rekindled that. It brought everything back into focus as to what really mattered.
Yeah. Sanjay, do you want to comment on that?
I remember calling the chief exec and then having a separate conversation with the finance director and saying, look, I think this is where this is going to go. And I don't know how, and I don't know in what way, but, how do you feel about this? I think this is going to be a big operation. I think we're going to spend a lot of money. I think we're going to have to work quick and take loads of risks. And, are you happy with that? Without being able to provide any particular detail at all, and having that kind of air cover, as I call it, was quite important to kind of almost know that what the parameters for risk taking were. But I completely agree with what Ken has said. I think for me, what we knew from the phone calls coming into our Connected Communities line and what people were asking for and the urgency of it, I would say I've never seen a single organisation and with multiple different parts to it, as colleagues will know, corporate teams, procurement teams, finance people, frontline staff, all the different kind of teams that make up a local government kind of context, all of them completely responding rapidly to what was needed, and not just on food, but on other things that were happening, just because that shared context was, oh my God, this is game-changing stuff for people's lives, and we need to just do whatever is right. And I think when we started to see the need and the scale of it urgently, just people just kept responding and going for it. So I remember one particular day we had quite early on, because we were relying early on donated food from what was called the London Food Alliance. So those three organisations, the Felix Project, City Harvest and Fair Share, we were relying on that of fresh food and ambient food to be able to deliver onwards. One day on a Tuesday, none of it arrived because their supply had just not happened, and we didn't know about it. And I remember a team of people, from people who normally drive children and young people with learning disabilities to different locations around the borough. We had people who normally do housing repairs. We had a vast number of voluntary and community sector organisations and just volunteers. All of us went to Costco, and we went and bought enough food for 170 deliveries that day, and put it on. It was my credit card, my personal credit card. And just because we knew that by the end of that day, we needed to deliver to 170 people. Firstly, I had no idea how I was going to get that money back from the council, because I don't work directly for the council. I couldn't do it through expenses. I didn't actually realise that until afterwards. But at the time, the focus was entirely on what's needed. And everyone just went, well, we'll come. And that was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We finished those deliveries at 10, 11 o'clock at night that day, and had started at 7 in the morning. And it didn't matter what your job role was. It didn't matter who you were. It was just, have you got a car? Can you get to this location? How do we get food? Can we ring ahead? Can we go in and buy it? Or can we, the definition of doing whatever's right and focused on a single thing, which was to get food to people. And so the level of risk taking, I think, in all of this, and what I've seen in what I've been part of, has probably, I've never seen before. We sort of ignored, to some degree, but in a polite way, any rules that we normally have needed to follow in order to just get done what was needed that day and the next day and so on. So that's just my reflection, really. I think just the fact that everybody, whomever you are and whoever you work for, were just all on the same page of what was needed.
And how do we, I'll come to you, Mark, because I can see you just raised your hand, but how do we keep that, obviously, to a safe point, because we can't continue forever in a let's not follow any rules. And we need to bring back some structure, and we need to be able to have that level of passion and that level of response without having that crisis, because, it isn't healthy or sustainable for everybody to be working in a crisis all the time. And I'm sure all the panel members are pretty tired round about now, because it's been quite a few weeks. So how do we keep that passion, that public service sense of purpose and passion alive without the crisis? How do we do that? How are you hoping to do that in Lancaster, Mark?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting point, because my view is that lots of the things that we do in councils, I could go and manage waste collection in the private sector, but I don't want to do that because I've got an ethos of public service. So, we still delivering waste collection, but I also think that when we deliver waste collection, we deliver it accountably. We deliver it in a way that meets the needs of our residents. We engage with our residents when we make changes. We're not sort of focused on just sort of making profits. So that sort of ethos of public service is always there. That's why you work in the public sector. That's why the majority of people choose to work in the public sector. So when something like this comes up, when you have this sort of real humanitarian crisis to deal with, all those sort of values and traits that our staff and elected members have, they all sort of come to the fore. So, somebody's like really competent at doing job X, but the real skills are the fact that they understand accountability, they understand public service, they've got a passion. So that's why I believe that we can do it. That's why we're so much better at delivering test and trace than Serco will be, because the emphasis just isn't there. So in terms of how we sustain that in the future, we've got to look at all the sort of good bits and really sort of have a sort of reset of what's important for our residents, what's important for our communities. How do we continue delivering on the things that are going to make a real difference? So, the emergency climate change sort of ties in with this, because climate change has a disproportionate impact on our most deprived communities. This COVID crisis has had disproportionate impacts on our most deprived communities, and that's not going to get better, and that's where we're going to have to start channeling our efforts. So some things that we've sort of prioritized in the past are going to have to be deprioritized and moved towards delivering on those sort of life and death type issues. You know, as district councils, when this crisis started, I said that, you know, very rarely do district councils get involved in life and limb issues. You know, so, you know, county councils do, but we have now sort of faced that. And because of the emergencies that are around us, because of the context of climate change, because of the context of pandemics, we are now dealing with life and limb issues. So there is, you know, the strategic focus needs to shift, and we need to harness that enthusiasm. We've seen which staff members have shone through, you know, and they're not, and it's not a sort of hierarchical thing. We've got to make the most of that and sort of rewrite the sort of what the council's about, and the sort of dialogue, the connections that we have with our communities, and that's how we'll sort of harness that.
Yeah. And there are comments in the chat, I'm sure everybody can see, about the economic crisis, the climate crisis, and certainly in Lancashire we've had flooding, droughts and fires quite near to my home recently. So there are other crises. I guess it's that I guess I was asking from an individual perspective of individual staff members to not always be in that crisis mode on a personal level, but to keep that passion going. I think that's a real that's something that we do need to try and do. Ken, you've raised your hand, and we've only got a couple of minutes left. But do you want to?
Yeah, just three very, very quick one sentences, I guess. I think there's something about what can we lose in terms of not necessarily priority areas, but in terms of bureaucracy and report writing. What can we kind of get out of our lives or reduce that can keep us, that can mean that we can still work in this way? I think there's something around, and Mark mentioned it there, around climate change. There's something around places having a sense of shared purpose and shared vision that can keep that motivation and energy going. I think there's something really important about organizations empowering their people to be able to stay in this kind of creative place, not too confined, but, you know, to give, I like Sanjay's phrase, to give people air cover, but also defining the parameters of risk so they can stay in that kind of creative, principle-based place. You know, a colleague of mine from Birmingham, a lady called Karen Creven, she always talks about being on the edge of chaos, and that's where really good things happen, not in chaos, but just close to the edge of it. And I think we've been in that place during this COVID pandemic, but I think we need to try and stay there, but perhaps just in a bit more of a controlled way.
That's great. Any other panel members want to say something before we close? No?
Yeah, yeah, I can. It just took me a minute to mute. I really like what Kevin's written in the chat there about imaginative, collaborative, and community engagement with Vital going forward. But we are well, I'm helping Harringay at the moment with what we're calling recovery renewal planning, which is how you come out of this particular phase, not out of COVID's over as we know, but a sort of crisis phase into something else. And we've been using a really, really helpful tool, which I can share with colleagues if helpful, which actually is developed by the RSA to help kind of think through sort of how you plan, but plan in a really practical way and harness some of the energy that's come out of it. And what they do is they've mapped kind of 4 boxes. One is sort of things that you did during a crisis that you just need to end. So the food provision, as I've described that we've done in Harringay, we can't keep doing this. We're spending 50 grand a week, and it's you know, out of 2 hubs, of one of which is going to start playing football again, you know, in a couple of weeks. So, you know, it's kind of, you can't sustain that, but you need to end it, but probably hang on to what has been done. And in the crisis, there's some stuff that we've tried that's been so different and great and innovative that we want to, they've called this amplify. What do you want to amplify? What do you want to actually bring to the fore and actually say, let's keep doing that? And then there's a kind of, okay, when you reflect on what you did before, what they call let go. So what are you sort of going to say, right, we used to do it in this way, we're just never going to do it like that ever again. And then lastly, there's a bit called restart, which is where you sort of say, right, we have to restart doing something that we didn't do before. A good example is like, you know, all the libraries closed, or, We have to sort of do something and open them up, but do we do it in the right way, and how do we harness what's happening? And it's a really interesting kind of tool, which is very simple, that we're using across the organisation to help people, kind of think about the next phase, but hang on to that energy. I'm not sure it quite does the job, Lucy, of what you said, which is that sort of pace, passion, and that immediacy, which I think to me is distinct to crisis. I think the colleagues who have been talking about flooding, you have, Lucy, and obviously other colleagues from Lancashire as well, have talked about this. Look, that is something that you are used to and you kind of know, but is really distinct to crisis, isn't it? That sort of passion and urgency. But there is a sort of what you hang on to principles wise coming out of it, which again is why I like what Kevin had written in the chat there. It's like, what are the principles you work to? But then I do think there is a sort of, how do you have a model that you work through with partners that can kind of take us into the next phase and think about what's going to come outside of a crisis, I suppose.
Yeah. Thank you. So we are out of time, and I know we have panel members that have meetings at 12 that will have to dial off. But I just wanted to say a huge thank you on behalf of Truman Change for everybody for taking part today, but also a huge thank you just as a resident of the UK for all of the work that you guys have done that is really quite incredible in looking after our communities at such a difficult time. I really hope that this has been helpful to everybody that's dialed in. It has been recorded and we will be putting it online. So if you'd like to watch anything back, then please do. And we do have a range of other sessions booked in of various themes, which are on our website, which is trumanchange.co.uk/events. So we've got some stuff around the HR impact we're trying to run a session on. So if you do know people that you'd like to take part in these, then please do give us a shout. We've got a session on Monday about leadership in a crisis. And I can see that there are some colleagues on the call today that will be on the panel for that. So we really look forward to that. Thank you so much for being part of this and for helping us to learn from this and figure out how we might do change differently going forward.
Thanks, Lucy. It's been great. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.